Say that again. Victoria Hayes didn't realize she was already standing when the words left her mouth, her voice unsteady, almost fragile in a room where it had never been anything but absolute, commanding, final. What did he just say? No one answered her right away. No one could. The conference room, usually filled with the quiet hum of million-dollar decisions and the soft tapping of polished shoes against marble floors, had fallen into something deeper than silence. It was the kind of stillness that made people forget how to breathe. A pen slipped from someone's hand. It clicked once against the table and rolled. No one reached for it. Because across the room, near the glass wall overlooking downtown Chicago, her son stood, small, still, and impossibly calm. Noah Hayes hadn't spoken in 3 years. Not a word. Not a whisper. Not even in his sleep. Doctors had called it trauma. Specialists had called it selective mutism. Victoria had called it the one problem her power couldn't solve. She had flown him to New York, to Boston, to a private clinic in Palo Alto that charged more per hour than most families made in a week. She had signed every check without blinking. And still, nothing. Silence had wrapped around her son like a second skin, and no amount of money had been able to peel it away. Until now. Hi, Ethan. The words had been soft, barely louder than a breath. But they landed like thunder. Victoria's chest tightened. Her mind refused to process it. She turned sharply, eyes searching, calculating, trying to find the mistake, the trick, the explanation that would restore order to a world she understood. Her gaze landed on the man standing a few feet away from Noah. He didn't look important. He didn't look like anyone who belonged in this room. Mid-40s, maybe. Work boots that had seen better days. A simple Navy maintenance uniform with a name tag slightly worn at the edges. Ethan Cole. He wasn't a therapist. He wasn't a specialist. He wasn't even supposed to be here. He had been fixing a flickering light in the hallway 15 minutes ago. You, Victoria said, her voice regaining a sharp edge, though it trembled just beneath the surface. What did you say to him? Ethan didn't rush to answer. He didn't step forward. He didn't defend himself. He just looked at Noah first, not at her, as if the boy's presence mattered more than the question hanging in the air. Nothing special, he said quietly. A few people in the room exchanged glances. That wasn't the answer anyone expected. Victoria narrowed her eyes. Children like my son don't just start talking to strangers, she said. Not without reason. Ethan nodded once, slow and steady. You're right, he said. The air shifted again. The city skyline outside the glass seemed distant now, blurred by something unseen. So, Victoria pressed. Why did he speak to you? Ethan finally met her gaze, not with defiance, not with pride, but with something quieter, something older. Because, he said, his voice calm, almost gentle, I didn't ask him to. The words settled into the room, soft and unassuming, and yet they carried a weight no one could immediately explain. Victoria's fingers tightened slightly at her sides. For the first time in years, she didn't have a response ready. And behind her, in that fragile space where silence had ruled for so long, her son took a small step forward, as if the world had just opened, and he was deciding whether to walk into it. The room did not return to normal after that moment. It only shifted into something quieter, heavier, as if every person inside had suddenly become aware of a truth they could not yet name. And in the center of it all, Ethan Cole stood exactly where he had been, shoulders relaxed, hands at his sides, not claiming anything, not explaining anything, just existing with a kind of stillness that did not belong in a place built on urgency and control, while Victoria Hayes slowly lowered herself back into her chair, not because she wanted to, but because her legs no longer trusted the ground beneath them, her mind replaying those two simple words again and again, trying to find logic inside something that felt entirely beyond it. Hi, Ethan, her son had said, clearly, softly, undeniably, and across from her Noah remained close to the glass wall, his small hand brushing faintly against the cool surface as sunlight spilled across the polished floor, catching the edges of his hair, illuminating a face that for years had been locked behind silence, and yet now carried something new, something open, something almost curious, and for a brief second he glanced back toward Ethan, not with fear, not with hesitation, but with recognition, as if the man was not a stranger at all, but someone he had been waiting to meet without ever knowing it. And that was what unsettled Victoria the most, not the word itself, but the ease of it, the absence of struggle, because every specialist had told her that progress would be slow, painful, fragile, something that needed careful structure and constant reinforcement. But there had been no structure here, no preparation, no clinical method, just a man in a worn uniform who had been fixing a hallway light less than 20 minutes ago, and now her son had spoken to him as naturally as breathing. "I need everyone to step out," Victoria said suddenly, her voice low but firm, and the room responded instantly. Chairs shifted, papers gathered, footsteps softened as executives and assistants moved toward the door, no one questioning her tone, no one daring to interrupt the fragile space forming between the three of them, until the door clicked shut and the city noise beyond the glass faded into a distant hum, leaving only the quiet rhythm of breath and the faint buzz of overhead lights. "Noah," she said more gently now, leaning forward slightly, her voice losing its edge. "Sweetheart, can you say that again?" The words came slower this time, careful, almost hopeful, but Noah did not answer right away. Instead, he looked down at his shoes, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, the silence returning, stretching, pressing against the walls like it always had. And for a moment Victoria felt that familiar fear creep back in, the fear that it had been a fluke, a sound without meaning, something that would disappear as quickly as it came. But then, Ethan moved, just slightly, not stepping closer, not reaching out, just lowering himself to one knee so that he was no longer towering above the boy, his presence smaller now, less imposing, and he spoke. Again, not to demand, not to guide, but simply to acknowledge. "It is okay," he said softly. "You do not have to say anything unless you want to." And there it was again, that same quiet tone, no pressure, no expectation, just space. And something in that space seemed to shift, because Noah's shoulders loosened just a little, his fingers uncurling at his sides, and slowly, almost hesitantly, he lifted his gaze back toward Ethan, his lips parting as if testing something fragile, something new. While Victoria held her breath without realizing it, every instinct in her screaming to intervene, to control, to protect, and yet for the first time she did nothing. She simply watched, because somewhere deep inside, beneath the years of power and certainty, she understood that whatever was happening in this moment did not belong to her. The moment stretched just long enough to feel uncertain, just long enough for doubt to whisper its way back into the room. And then Noah inhaled softly, the sound barely audible, his small chest rising as if he were gathering courage from somewhere deeper than words. And when he spoke again, it was not louder, not clearer, but it was real. "Ethan," he said, this time without hesitation, and the name settled into the air like something that had always belonged there. Victoria's hand instinctively moved to her mouth, her breath catching as her eyes widened, not in shock now, but in something far more fragile, something closer to hope, and she leaned forward in her chair, her voice trembling despite every effort to steady it. "Noah, sweetheart, can you say anything else?" she asked gently, each word carefully placed. But the room seemed to tighten again at the question, the pressure returning, subtle but present, and Noah's shoulders drew in just slightly, his gaze lowering once more as the silence crept back toward him, familiar and heavy, and Ethan saw it immediately, the shift, the hesitation, the way expectation could close a door that had only just begun to open. So he spoke again, calm and even. "It is okay," he repeated, softer this time, his tone almost like a quiet reassurance carried on the air itself. "You already did something important," and there was no praise in his voice, no excitement, just simple truth. And somehow that mattered more, because Noah's fingers relaxed again, the tension easing from his small frame as he looked back up, not at his mother, not at the room, but at Ethan, and for a second the world outside the glass disappeared completely, the city noise fading into nothing as that quiet connection held. And Victoria watched it unfold with a growing sense that she was witnessing something she could not buy, could not command, could not replicate, and it unsettled her in a way that no business deal ever had. Because for the first time she was not in control of the outcome, and yet it was working, slowly, gently, without force. "How long have you been here?" she asked suddenly, her voice regaining a slight edge as she turned toward Ethan, searching for something solid to hold on to, something she could understand. And he glanced briefly toward the hallway, as if measuring time not by clocks, but by moments. About 3 months, he answered. Maintenance contract. And the simplicity of it only deepened the mystery. Victoria frowned slightly, her mind racing through security logs, employee records, trying to place him into a system that made sense. And you have never interacted with my son before today? She pressed, and Ethan shook his head once. Not directly, he said, and then added after a small pause. But I have seen him. The words were quiet, almost careful, and they drew her attention sharply. Seen him where? She asked, and Ethan shifted his weight slightly, still kneeling, still grounded. In the hallway outside your office, he said. Sometimes in the mornings, he continued. He stands by the window. Victoria blinked, the detail catching her off guard, because it was true. Noah often lingered there, silent, watching the city wake up, something she had never thought twice about, something she had never considered might be seen by anyone else. He listens. Ethan added softly, and that word seemed to land differently, because listening implied something active, something present, not just absence of speech, and Victoria's expression shifted, her certainty cracking just a little. He does not speak, she said, almost defensively, and Ethan nodded gently. That does not mean he has nothing to say, he replied, and the room fell quiet again. But this time it was not empty. It was full of something unspoken yet deeply understood, and behind them, near the glass, Noah took one small step closer, as if drawn not by expectation, not by pressure, but by the quiet permission to simply be heard. Noah's step was small, barely the length of a shoe, but it carried a weight that shifted the entire room, and Victoria felt it in a way she could not explain, like watching something fragile choose to exist after years of hiding. And she did not move this time. She did not speak. She only watched as her son closed the distance between himself and the man who had somehow reached him without trying, without pushing, without asking for anything in return, and Ethan remained where he was, still. Kneeling, still grounded, his posture open, his hands resting loosely on his knees, not reaching out, not inviting, simply allowing space. And that space seemed to matter more than any word spoken so far. You do not have to come closer, Ethan said quietly, his voice steady, not loud enough to fill the room, but enough to reach the boy standing just a few feet away, and Noah paused, considering, his eyes fixed on Ethan's face as if searching for something familiar, something safe, and after a brief moment he took another step, slower this time, more certain, until he stood within arm's reach, the sunlight from the window catching the edge of his sleeve, casting a soft glow across the floor between them, and for a second neither of them spoke, the silence returning, but no longer heavy, no longer suffocating. Instead it felt like a held breath waiting for permission to release. You fixed the light, Noah said suddenly, his voice still soft but clearer now, and Victoria's heart seemed to stop entirely, because it was not just a word this time. It was a sentence, simple, observant, real, and Ethan gave a small nod, almost as if this exchange was the most natural thing in the world. Yeah, he replied gently. It was flickering, he added, keeping his tone calm, unhurried, and Noah glanced briefly toward the ceiling, then back at Ethan. It was loud, he said, and Ethan's expression softened just slightly, understanding settling in his eyes. Some sounds can feel louder than they are, he said, not correcting, not explaining too much, just meeting the boy where he stood, and Noah seemed to accept that, his shoulders easing as if something inside him had just been acknowledged for the first time, and behind them Victoria pressed, her fingers lightly against the edge of the table, grounding herself in the moment, her mind racing through every therapy session, every failed attempt to reach this exact point, and none of it looked like this, none of it felt like this, because this was not structured, it was not controlled, it was simply happening. Why did you not talk before? She asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it, her voice softer now, less commanding, more searching, and the moment she spoke it, the air shifted again, just slightly, and Noah's gaze flickered, uncertainty returning for a brief second, but Ethan did not look at her. He kept his attention on the boy, giving him time, giving him choice, and after a pause Noah spoke again, quieter this time but still present. Too loud, he said, and the words landed with a quiet truth that needed no further explanation, and Ethan nodded once more. "Then we keep it quiet," he replied, simple, steady, and something about that answer seemed to settle into the room like a promise, not dramatic, not grand, just enough. And for the first time, Victoria felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in years, not control, not certainty, but a quiet kind of hope that did not demand anything. It simply waited, and in that waiting, her son took another small breath, as if he was finally learning how to exist in a world that no longer overwhelmed him. Victoria did not speak right away after that, not because she did not have questions, but because for the first time she understood that asking them might break something fragile that had only just begun to form. And so she stayed where she was, watching as Noah stood a little straighter than before, his small frame no longer folded inward but open in a way that felt unfamiliar and yet deeply right. While Ethan slowly rose from his kneeling position, not towering over the boy, but simply returning to a neutral stance, his presence steady and unintrusive, as if he had done nothing extraordinary at all, and that was exactly what unsettled the balance of the room. Because everything about Victoria's world had always been built on intention, on strategy, on control, and yet this moment had unfolded without any of those things. "We are not finished here," she said finally, her voice quieter now, but still carrying authority, and Ethan gave a slight nod, not in submission but in acknowledgement. "I am just here to fix what needs fixing," he replied, the words simple, almost literal, but they lingered in a way that felt larger than the task itself, and Victoria studied him carefully, her eyes narrowing just slightly as she tried to understand how a man who blended into the background could suddenly become the center of something she had failed to solve for years. "You will stay," she said, more statement than request, and for the first time Ethan hesitated, not out of fear but out of consideration, his gaze briefly shifting toward Noah before returning to her. "I will finish my shift," he answered calmly, and there was something in that response that did not align with her expectations, because it was not eager, not opportunistic, it was grounded in something else entirely, something that did not bend easily to power or pressure, and for a brief second Victoria felt that unfamiliar sensation again, the one she could not control, the one that felt like respect forming in a space where she had not intended it to. And behind them Noah shifted his weight again, glancing between the two adults, as if sensing the change in tone, the subtle tension that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the difference between two worlds colliding quietly. "In the same room, will you fix the other light?" Noah asked suddenly, his voice softer again but still present, and both adults turned toward him at the same time, the simplicity of the question cutting through everything else, and Ethan's expression softened just slightly as he followed the boy's gaze toward the far corner of the ceiling. "If it needs fixing," he replied, and Noah nodded, as if that answer alone was enough, and Victoria felt her chest tighten again, not from fear this time, but from the realization that her son was not just speaking, he was choosing when to speak, choosing how, and that choice had never belonged to her, not really. Not in the way she had believed, and the room seemed to settle into a new kind of quiet, one that did not demand anything, did not rush forward, but simply allowed the moment to exist. And for the first time in a long time, Victoria did not try to move it forward. She did not try to control the outcome. She simply watched as the man she had overlooked for months walked toward the far wall, ladder in hand, moving with the same steady rhythm he had always had. And yet now every step carried a weight that no title, no position, no wealth could replicate, because somewhere between a flickering light and a quiet voice, something real had begun, and it did not belong to power, it belonged to presence. The ladder clicked softly as Ethan set it into place beneath the second light, the faint metallic sound echoing just enough to remind the room that something ordinary was happening again, something simple, measurable, familiar. And yet nothing about the air felt ordinary anymore, because behind him Noah had moved closer, not rushed, not called, just drawn by a quiet curiosity that seemed to grow with every passing second. And Victoria noticed it immediately, the way her son followed without being asked, the way his steps were no longer hesitant but intentional, as if he was choosing to stay within the space Ethan created rather than retreating into the silence that had once defined him. And for a moment she almost spoke, almost told him to come back, to sit, to remain within the boundaries she understood, but she stopped herself, the instinct fading before it reached her lips, replaced by something quieter, something that felt like trust forming slowly in unfamiliar ground. Might flicker again before it settles, Ethan said as he climbed, his voice steady, directed not at Victoria but at Noah, who stood just a few feet away looking up, his eyes tracking every movement. Why? Noah asked, the question soft but clear, and the word hung in the air like a small miracle that no one dared interrupt, and Ethan paused for just a second on the third rung, considering his answer not as a technician but as someone who understood something deeper. Because sometimes things need time to adjust, he said, simple, measured, and Noah nodded slightly, as if that explanation reached beyond the light itself, as if it applied to something inside him as well, and Victoria felt that connection again, subtle but undeniable, the way Ethan spoke without teaching, without correcting, just offering space for understanding to exist, and it unsettled her in the quietest way, because she had spent years searching for methods, for solutions, for expertise. And yet this man was doing something none of those things had accomplished, not by force, not by knowledge alone, but by presence, and she could not explain it, which meant she could not control it. And that realization sat heavier than anything else. Do you have children? She asked suddenly, the question slipping out before she could weigh it, and Ethan did not answer right away, his hand adjusting the fixture with careful precision, the soft click of the bulb settling into place filling the brief silence. I do, he said finally, his voice quieter now, not distant but grounded in something that carried weight without needing to show it. And Victoria watched him more closely now, searching for something in his expression, some clue to the calm he carried so naturally. And they speak to you? She pressed, not challenging, but trying to understand the difference between his world and hers, and Ethan tightened the last screw before responding. Sometimes, he said, and there was a softness in that answer that did not match expectation, not certainty, not assumption, just truth, and Noah glanced between them again, absorbing the exchange in his own quiet way, and then, without prompting, he spoke once more. Do they get loud? He asked, and the question carried something deeper, something personal, and Ethan looked down at him from the ladder, not smiling, not reassuring in the usual way, just present. Sometimes, he repeated, but we learn when to be quiet together. And Noah seemed to consider that, his small brow furrowing slightly before relaxing again, and Victoria felt something shift inside her, something she had not allowed herself to feel before, not doubt, but recognition. The understanding that perhaps the silence she had tried so hard to break was never meant to be forced open, that perhaps it needed to be met, gently, patiently, without expectation, and above them the light steadied, no longer flickering, its glow settling into a constant warmth that filled the room without drawing attention to itself, and Ethan climbed down slowly, his boots meeting the floor with a soft, grounded sound, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all, and yet everything had changed. The light above them held steady now, no flicker, no hum, just a quiet, consistent glow that settled into the room as if it had always been there. And for a moment no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because something deeper had taken its place, something that did not need words to exist, and Ethan stepped back from the ladder, folding it with slow, deliberate movements, the metal joints clicking softly into place, while Noah remained where he was, his gaze still lifted, not at the light anymore, but at the man who had fixed it without making a moment out of it. And Victoria watched both of them with a growing awareness that what she was seeing could not be measured, could not be scheduled, could not be controlled, and yet it was working in a way nothing else had. You said you have children, she spoke again, her voice quieter now, less like a command and more like a question she was not sure she had the right to ask. And Ethan paused briefly before answering, his hand resting on the folded ladder. I have a daughter, he said, simple, direct, and something in the way he said it carried a weight that did not need explanation, and Victoria leaned forward slightly, her attention sharpening. How old? She asked, and Ethan glanced toward Noah for just a second before responding. She would be about his age, he said, and the room shifted again, not with tension this time, but with something softer, something that settled into the spaces between words, and Victoria felt it immediately. The implication, the absence inside that sentence that spoke louder than anything else, would be. She repeated quietly, not pressing, just acknowledging. And Ethan nodded once, his expression unchanged, not guarded, not open, simply steady, and Noah looked between them, his small brow furrowing slightly as if he sensed something deeper than the conversation itself, something he could not fully understand but could feel, and after a moment he spoke again, softer this time. "Where is she?" And the question landed gently, without intrusion, without expectation, just curiosity, and Ethan lowered his gaze slightly, not away from the boy, but inward, as if the answer existed somewhere he carried quietly every day. "She is not here," he said, and there was no hesitation, no avoidance, just truth, and Noah seemed to accept that, his shoulders relaxing as he processed the words in his own way, and Victoria felt something inside her shift again, a recognition that this man's calm was not something he had always possessed. It was something he had earned, something shaped by loss, by silence, by understanding the spaces where words do not always reach. And it changed the way she saw him, not as an employee, not as a stranger, but as someone who understood her son in a way she had been trying to learn for years. "You knew," she said quietly, almost to herself, and Ethan looked at her briefly, not questioning, just listening. "You knew how to speak to him," she continued, and Ethan shook his head slightly. "No," he said, "I knew how not to." And the simplicity of that answer seemed to settle into the room like a truth no one had considered before, and Noah took one small step closer again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Will you come back?" he asked, and this time there was no hesitation in the air, no uncertainty in the moment, just a quiet question waiting for an honest answer, and Ethan met his gaze, steady and calm. "I will be here tomorrow," he said, not promising more than that. Not building anything beyond the present, just offering what was real, and for Noah that seemed to be enough, because he nodded once, small but certain, and for the first time since the silence had broken, Victoria allowed herself to breathe without holding it back, realizing that something had begun not because it was forced, not because it was planned, but because it had been given the space to exist. The room did not rush back to life after that promise. It simply settled into a quieter rhythm, as if everyone inside understood that something delicate had begun and any sudden movement might disturb it, and Ethan lifted the folded ladder with one hand, not in a hurry, not lingering either, just continuing the work he had been hired to do, while Noah remained close, his presence no longer hesitant but calm, as if he had found a place where he did not need to disappear, and Victoria watched them both with a stillness that would have surprised anyone who knew her, because she was not calculating, not directing, not even questioning in that moment. She was simply observing, and that alone marked a shift more significant than any word spoken so far. "You always come in the mornings," she said after a while, her voice measured, quieter than before. And Ethan nodded slightly without looking up from the tools he was placing back into his bag. "Early works better," he replied, and she studied him again, noticing the small details she had overlooked for months, the worn edges of his gloves, the careful way he handled each piece of equipment, the absence of any need to impress, and it unsettled her in a way that felt unfamiliar, because everything about him existed outside the system she trusted, outside the structure that had built her entire life. "You could be doing something else," she said, not as a challenge, but as an observation, and Ethan paused just long enough to consider the weight of that statement before answering. "I am," he said simply, and the words landed softly but carried a quiet certainty that needed no expansion, and for a brief moment Victoria had no response, because she understood that he meant more than maintenance, more than fixing lights. He meant this presence, this quiet way of meeting people where they were without trying to change them, and it was something she could not buy, could not assign, could not replicate with any team or strategy. And behind her Noah shifted again, glancing between them before stepping slightly closer to Ethan, his voice small but steady. "Will you fix more tomorrow?" he asked, and Ethan looked down at him, not smiling, not exaggerating the moment, just answering with the same calm truth he had offered all along. "If there is something that needs fixing," he said, and Noah nodded once, satisfied, as if the answer itself held a promise without needing to be one. And Victoria felt something loosen inside her chest, something she had been holding tightly for years without realizing it. And it was not relief exactly. It was not control returning. It was something quieter, something closer to acceptance. And for the first time, she understood that what her son needed was not pressure, not expectation, not even solutions, but space. Space to speak when he was ready, space to be heard without demand, space to exist without being pulled into a world that had always been too loud for him. And as Ethan closed his tool bag and turned toward the door, there was no dramatic pause, no final statement, just a simple movement toward leaving. And Victoria stood as well, not out of habit, but out of something more intentional. "Ethan," she said, stopping him just before he reached the handle. And he turned back, steady as always. "Thank you," she added, the words unfamiliar on her tongue in this context. Not as a formality, not as a transaction, but as something real. And Ethan held her gaze for a brief second, then gave a small nod, not accepting praise, not dismissing it either, just acknowledging it as it was. And then he left, the door closing softly behind him, leaving the room quieter than before, and yet fuller. And Noah stood near the window again, looking out at the city below before speaking one more time, softer than before but clear. "He listens." And Victoria felt her eyes sting slightly as she turned toward him, understanding now that the miracle she had been searching for had not come from power or knowledge or control, but from something far simpler, something she had almost forgotten how to give: the quiet dignity of being present and the grace of allowing silence to become something more than absence. The door had barely settled into its frame before the room seemed to exhale, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a quiet release that could be felt more than heard. And Victoria remained standing where she was, her eyes still on the place where Ethan had disappeared, as if something of him had not fully left with the closing of that door. And behind her, Noah shifted closer to the window again, his small hand resting against the glass, tracing nothing in particular, just existing in a way that no longer felt hidden. And for a long moment neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the silence between them had changed. It was no longer something to break, it was something to understand. "He listens," Noah had said, and those words stayed with her, echoing in a way that no boardroom conversation ever had, because listening was not something she had struggled with in business. She listened to numbers, to projections, to outcomes, but this was different. This required something she had not practiced, something that could not be measured or predicted. And slowly she walked toward her son, her steps softer than usual against the polished floor, her posture no longer commanding but careful, as if approaching a space that required respect rather than control. "What did you hear?" she asked gently, her voice lower now, warmer. And Noah did not answer right away. He looked out at the city, at the movement far below, the cars like small lines of motion, the people unseen but present. And then he spoke, quiet but clear. He was not loud, he said, and Victoria felt something shift inside her again, because it was not just about sound, it was about presence, about the absence of pressure, about the safety of being allowed to exist without demand. And she nodded slowly, not correcting, not guiding, just accepting the truth as he understood it. And after a moment she added, "Did it feel different?" And Noah turned to look at her, really look this time, his eyes steady, open in a way she had not seen in years. "It felt quiet," he said, and the word carried more meaning than any explanation could. And Victoria felt her breath catch slightly as she realized that quiet was not emptiness to him. It was safety, it was space. It was where his voice could finally exist. And she lowered herself to his level, not out of habit, but out of intention, mirroring something she had seen without realizing it mattered. "We can keep it that way," she said softly, not as a promise she could guarantee, but as something she was willing to learn. And Noah nodded once, small but certain, and the moment settled around them, not with finality, but with continuation, as if this was not the end of something but the beginning of a different way forward. And outside the glass the city continued as it always had, fast, loud, relentless. But inside the room something had